The Arizona sun beat down on Samuel Cross like the hammer of God himself, unforgiving and absolute. He knelt in the dust beside a fence post that had seen better days, his calloused hands working the wire stretcher with the kind of precision that only comes from 3 decades of hard labor. The barbed wire gleamed in the afternoon light, 4 strands of Glidden-patterned steel that separated his land from the wild country beyond. Each twist of the tool sent a small metallic screech across the plains, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. 47 years old, and Samuel Cross looked every day of it. His face was weathered leather, creased by sun and sorrow in equal measure. Gray threaded through his dark hair, more silver than black now, and his hands bore the scars of 1,000 small battles with this unforgiving land. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had witnessed too much death, still held a fierce clarity. They were the eyes of a man who had learned that mercy and justice rarely walk the same path, but who chose mercy anyway, every single time. The fence stretched east to west across his property line, marking the boundary of Cross Creek Ranch. 640 acres of desert scrubland, rocky outcrops, and sparse grassland that somehow managed to support 150 head of cattle. It wasn't much, not compared to the sprawling empires of men like Leonard Graves who owned half the county, but it was his, paid for with sweat and blood and the kind of back-breaking work that aged a man faster than time alone ever could. Samuel straightened, pressing one hand to the small of his back where the old ache lived, permanent as the mountains on the horizon. He reached for his canteen, took a long pull of lukewarm water, and surveyed his domain. The ranch house stood a quarter-mile to the north, a simple structure of adobe and timber that Sarah had made into a home all those years ago. The barn where David had died was still there too, rebuilt after the fire but forever haunted by the memory of that night. And on the hill beyond, beneath a lone oak tree, 3 wooden crosses marked the graves of everyone Samuel had ever loved: Sarah, Benjamin, David, his wife, his son, his brother. All gone now, taken by fever and accident and murder, leaving him alone with ghosts and debts he could never repay. $800. That was what he owed to Redemption Bank, and by extension to Leonard Graves, who owned the bank the way he owned everything else in this county. 3 months remained before the note came due, and Samuel had maybe half that amount saved. He would lose the ranch. He knew that. Graves would take it, the way Graves had taken David's land 3 years ago. The way Graves took everything he wanted, hiding behind lawyers and sheriffs, and the veneer of civilization that masked the brutal machinery of theft. Samuel bent back to his work, driving staples into the cedar post with methodical strikes of his hammer. The rhythm was meditative, almost peaceful. Strike, breathe, strike, breathe. This was the language he understood, the vocabulary of physical labor and tangible results. You fixed what was broken. You built what needed building. You protected what you could protect. Simple rules for a simple life, or at least what passed for simple out here in the territories where the law was whatever the man with the most guns said it was. A sound cut through his thoughts, faint at first, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the mesquite. But Samuel had learned long ago to trust his ears the way a blind man trusts his cane. He stopped hammering, head cocked, listening. There it was again. A scream, high and sharp, the sound of pure terror. He was running before he made the conscious decision to move, his body responding to some primal instinct that existed deeper than thought. The brass telescope was in his saddlebag, an heirloom from his father who had carried it through 3 wars and died peacefully in his sleep at 72. Samuel yanked it free, extended it with a practiced twist, and scanned the eastern horizon. 2 miles out, maybe less, a figure in black stumbled through the dry grass. Even at this distance, Samuel could see the distinctive shape of a nun's habit, the white wimple bright against the desert browns and golds. She fell, struggled to rise, fell again. And then Samuel saw it, the sinuous shape sliding away through the grass, its rattling warning lost in the distance but unmistakable in its movement. Rattlesnake. Samuel was already running for his horse before the telescope collapsed in his hands. Apollo stood tethered to a scrub oak, a 12-year-old Appaloosa gelding with more heart than any horse Samuel had ever known. The animal sensed his urgency, ears pricked forward, muscles already tensing for the run. Samuel hit the saddle in one fluid motion, a movement practiced 10,000 times until it became reflex, and drove his heels into Apollo's flanks. The horse exploded forward, hooves tearing up clods of dry earth, mane whipping in the wind. Samuel leaned low over Apollo's neck, urging more speed from an animal already giving everything it had. 2 miles. At a full gallop, maybe 4 minutes, but every second mattered when venom was involved. He had seen what rattlesnake poison could do to a man, had watched David thrash and scream when one bit him back in '82. Samuel had saved him that time, had cut and sucked the venom before it spread too far. He had saved David from the snake, but he had not saved David from the men who burned him alive 2 years later. The ground blurred beneath him, sagebrush and cactus rushing past in streaks of green and brown. His mind was already working through the procedure, the steps he would need to take. Identify the bite location. Cut an X over each fang mark. Suck the venom, spit it out. Don't swallow. Bind the wound, get her to help. Simple steps, life or death measured in simple steps. He saw her more clearly now as Apollo closed the distance. Young, maybe late 20s, her face pale with shock and fear. She had managed to prop herself against a boulder, one hand clutching her leg where the black fabric of her habit was already darkening with blood. Her eyes found him as he approached, wide with terror and something else. Shame, perhaps, or embarrassment. The look of a woman raised on rules and propriety now facing a situation where those rules meant nothing at all. Samuel pulled Apollo up hard, the horse skidding to a stop in a spray of dust and pebbles. He was on the ground before the animal had fully stopped, his medical bag already in hand. He kept basic supplies in his saddlebag now, ever since Sarah died because he could not get the medicine to her in time. Bandages, laudanum, a clean knife, the tools of amateur surgery in a land where professional help was 2 days right away. The nun tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly. Up close, Samuel could see the sweat beating on her forehead, the tremor in her hands, the rapid pulse visible in her throat. Shock was setting in, the body's response to trauma and fear. He had maybe 20 minutes before the venom spread enough to cause permanent damage, maybe 40 before she died. He dropped to his knees beside her, his voice calm and level despite the urgency screaming through his veins. "Sister, my name is Samuel Cross. I am going to help you, but I need to see the wound. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Her hand moved to her leg, hesitated, moved again. The conflict was written across her face as clearly as words on a page. Years of training, of rules and vows, and the strict doctrine of modesty, all warring against the animal instinct to survive. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It is not proper. I took vows before God. I cannot let a man touch me. I cannot show you. I cannot." Samuel had no time for this. He understood her fear, understood the weight of those vows, but understanding would not save her life. "Sister," he said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from burying everyone he loved. "I see 2 fang marks on your leg. The venom is hemotoxic. That means it destroys tissue. It is already spreading through your bloodstream. I need to cut the wound and suck out the poison. If I do not do this in the next 15 minutes, you will lose that leg. If I do not do this in the next 30 minutes, you will die. Your vows will not matter if you are dead. Do you understand?" She stared at him, and Samuel saw the moment the decision crystallized behind her eyes. Not acceptance exactly, more like surrender. The acknowledgement that sometimes survival required breaking the very rules that defined you. "Do it," she breathed. "Quickly. Please, just do it quickly." Her hands shook violently as she gathered the fabric of her habit, lifting it with agonizing slowness. Samuel kept his eyes on hers, giving her what dignity he could in this moment when all dignity had been stripped away. Only when she had exposed the wound did he look down. High on her right thigh, just above where her black stockings ended, 2 puncture marks wept blood and clear fluid. The skin around them had already begun to swell, turning an angry red that would soon darken to purple. He could see the tracks where the fangs had penetrated, could calculate the depth and the probable amount of venom injected. Western diamondback, probably 4 feet long judging by the distance between the punctures. A mature snake, which meant a full load of poison. Samuel pulled his Bowie knife from its sheath, 9 inches of carbon steel that his father had carried and his grandfather before him. The blade caught the sunlight, throwing sharp reflections across the woman's terrified face. He reached for his canteen, poured water over the steel, a token gesture at cleanliness in a situation where infection was the least of their worries. "This will hurt," he said simply, because there was no point in lying. He made the first cut, a shallow X directly over the upper fang mark. The sister gasped but did not cry out. Her jaw clenched so tightly Samuel could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin. Blood welled immediately, bright red against pale flesh. He made the second cut over the lower puncture, the same careful depth, just enough to open the wound without hitting anything vital. Then Samuel bent his head and pressed his mouth to her thigh. The taste was immediate and foul, a mix of blood and venom and the salty tang of skin. He sucked hard, pulling the poison into his mouth, careful not to swallow, careful to keep his lips sealed around the wound. After 3 seconds, he turned his head and spat into the dirt, a stream of dark fluid that stained the sand. Again, suck, spit, suck, spit. 4 times he repeated the process until the liquid he expelled ran more red than yellow, until he could taste only blood and not the bitter chemical burn of venom. He looked up to tell her it was done, to offer some word of comfort or reassurance, and froze. A wagon had stopped on the road 30 yards away. Not a small buggy or a single rider, but a Fiat wagon, the kind merchants used to haul goods between Redemption and the smaller settlements to the east. 3 women stood in the back, all dressed in their Sunday clothes, all staring with identical expressions of shock and horror. And beside the wagon, holding the reins of the team, sat Ezra Boone, a farmer Samuel knew by reputation, if not by friendship. Samuel understood immediately what they saw. A man kneeling between a woman's legs, his face pressed against her exposed thigh, his mouth stained red. They could not see the snake that had already slithered away. They could not see the fang marks hidden by his position. They could not see anything except what their minds wanted them to see, what their gossip-hungry souls needed them to see. The biggest woman, Harriet Boone, if Samuel remembered correctly, pointed at him with one trembling finger. Her mouth opened, and the scream that emerged was shrill enough to startle birds from the nearby mesquite. "Lord have mercy! He is defiling a nun! Someone stop him! Stop him right now!" Samuel slowly straightened, his hands held out to his sides in a gesture of peace. Blood dripped from his chin. The sister's habit was still bunched around her waist. There was no arrangement of facts, no explanation that would make this scene look like anything other than what they thought it was. "Now hold on," Samuel started, his voice calm despite the adrenaline spiking through his system. "This woman was bitten by a rattlesnake. I was removing the venom. That is all that happened here." Ezra Boone's face had gone red, the color of a man whose sense of righteousness had been offended. He stood up in the wagon box, one hand reaching for something beneath the seat. Samuel tensed, calculating distances and angles, wondering if he would have to fight his way out of an act of mercy. "Liar!" Harriet Boone shrieked. "We saw what we saw. You had your mouth on her, on a woman of God. You animal, you filthy animal." "Ma'am, if you would just let me explain." But they were not interested in explanations. Harriet turned to her companions, both of whom nodded eagerly, already composing the story they would tell, already building the narrative that would spread through Redemption like wildfire. The second woman, thin and pinched-looking, actually smiled as she spoke. "We should tell Reverend Clark immediately. He will know what to do. He will make sure this man faces justice." "Justice?" Samuel felt anger rising now, hot and sharp in his chest. "Justice for saving a life?" But the wagon was already turning, Ezra Boone whipping the team into motion with more violence than necessary. The women clung to their as the vehicle bounced over the rough ground, their voices carrying back across the desert air. "Wait until the town hears about this. A nun! He assaulted a nun! String him up! That is what they should do! String him up!" Samuel watched them disappear in a cloud of dust, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. Beside him, the sister had pulled her habit back down, her face now pale for reasons that had nothing to do with snake venom. She looked up at him, and in her eyes Samuel saw the understanding, the terrible knowledge of what was about to happen. "They will not believe the truth," she said quietly. "Will they?" Samuel turned back to her, forced his anger down into that deep place where he kept all his rage. He pulled bandages from his bag, began wrapping her thigh with steady hands. No, sister, they will not believe the truth. Truth is not nearly as interesting as scandal. And in a town like Redemption, scandal is the only entertainment most folks have. He tied off the bandage, checked the tightness, not a tourniquet, just firm enough to protect the wound. She would need real medical attention, a doctor if they could find one, but for now she would live. The venom he had removed, the poison would not spread. She would hurt for days, would carry the scars forever, but she would survive. Unlike Samuel's reputation, which had just died in front of 3 witnesses. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded, using his arm to pull herself upright. She swayed, and Samuel caught her before she fell, one arm around her waist, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs through the heavy fabric. Too thin, he thought. They did not feed her enough at that convent. But then, religious devotion often came with a side of deprivation. He helped her onto Apollo, then swung up behind her. The horse snorted at the double weight, but did not complain. Good old Apollo, steady and reliable as the sunrise. Samuel turned the animal north, toward the white walls of St. Catherine Convent, visible on the horizon. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of hooves and the woman's labored breathing. Finally she spoke, her voice so soft Samuel had to lean forward to hear. "Why did you help me? You must have known what it would look like." Samuel considered the question, considered all the possible answers. Because it was the right thing to do. Because he was a doctor once, before the war took that dream away. Because he could not stand by and watch another person die. But in the end, he spoke the truest answer, the one that lived in the deepest part of his soul. Because I could not save my wife when the fever took her. I could not save my son when his neck broke. I could not save my brother when they burned him. Maybe God gave me one more chance to get something right. Maybe this was it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "Thank you." They crested a small rise and St. Catherine Convent came into full view. It was not a large structure, just a 2-story adobe building with a bell tower and a small courtyard surrounded by a low wall. Maybe 20 nuns lived there, providing education to the handful of children in the area and medical care to anyone who could not afford a real doctor. Samuel had never been inside. He had no reason to enter a convent, and the nuns had no reason to seek out a widowed rancher living alone with his ghosts. He pulled Apollo to a stop at the main gate, helped the sister slide down from the saddle. She winced as her injured leg took weight, but she stayed upright, one hand pressed against the gate for support. "What is your name?" Samuel asked, "in case I need to testify about what happened here." "Margaret," she said, "Sister Margaret Louise Hartwell. And I will tell them the truth, Mr. Cross. I will tell them you saved my life." Samuel looked down at her, at this small woman in black who had just promised to stand against the tide of gossip and accusation that was surely building even now. He wanted to tell her it would not matter, that her truth would be drowned out by lies. But he saw something in her eyes, a core of steel beneath the fear, and he decided not to insult her courage with his cynicism. "I believe you will, sister. I truly do. But truth and justice are not always friends, particularly not in a place like Redemption. Just remember that when they start asking questions." He touched the brim of his hat in salute, turned Apollo, and rode away without looking back. He had work to do, fences to mend, cattle to check, and he had maybe 3 hours before Sheriff Nathaniel Blackwood came looking for him with irons and accusations. 3 hours to prepare for the storm he saw gathering on the horizon. Margaret watched him disappear into the desert shimmer, one hand still gripping the iron gate. She had spent 8 years behind these walls, believing her vows were holy service. But standing here with her leg throbbing and blood still damp on the bandages, a question slithered through her mind like the snake that had bitten her. Had she taken those vows from devotion or from cowardice? Had she been serving or hiding from life? The thought terrified her more than the rattlesnake's fangs ever had. She pushed it down deep, but it would not stay buried. Behind him, the convent gate creaked open, and Sister Margaret disappeared into the white walls, limping but alive. Samuel allowed himself one moment of satisfaction. Whatever else happened, whatever lies were told and believed, he had saved a life today. That had to count for something, even if the final tally came up short. The sun was starting its descent toward the western mountains when Samuel finally made it back to his ranch. The fence work lay abandoned, tools scattered in the dust where he had dropped them. He gathered them mechanically, his mind already moving ahead, planning and calculating. Blackwood would come. That was certain. The question was whether he would come alone or with a mob, whether this would end in a jail cell or at the end of a rope. Samuel walked to the barn, the same barn where David had died 3 years ago. The structure had been completely rebuilt, new timber and new shingles. But Samuel could still smell the smoke sometimes when the wind blew from the east. Could still hear his brother's screams, though the doctors said that was impossible, that David would have died from the smoke before the flames ever touched him. The doctors lied, of course. Or maybe they just did not know what guilt could make a man hear in the dark hours before dawn. Inside the barn, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Apollo's stall, Samuel kept a metal box. He pulled it out now, opened the rusted lock with a key he wore on a leather cord around his neck. Inside was $300 in gold coins, his deed to the ranch, and a letter he had written years ago to no one in particular. His will, such as it was. If he died, the ranch would go to Father Michael O'Reilly, the Catholic priest who ran the small church in Redemption. Michael would know what to do with it, would make sure it went to someone who needed it. Samuel pulled out pen and ink, added a codicil to the will in his careful, cramped handwriting. If anything happened to him, if he did not return from whatever was coming, Michael was to investigate, was to find the truth about David's death, about the fire that was no accident, about the two men who had stood in the darkness and laughed while his brother burned, Nathaniel Blackwood and Leonard Graves. Samuel had been investigating them for 3 years, gathering evidence, talking to witnesses who were too afraid to speak publicly. He had found boot prints at the scene, size 11, the same size Blackwood wore. He had found a kerosene tin hidden in the brush, the kind sold only at Graves' general store. He had testimony from a Mexican ranch hand who had seen two men riding away from the fire, though the man refused to swear to it in court. It was not enough. It would never be enough, not in a county where Blackwood wore the badge and Graves owned the bank. But Samuel kept digging, kept searching, because that was all he had left. David deserved justice, even if justice in this world was a rare and precious thing. He sealed the letter, placed it back in the box, and buried the box again beneath Apollo's stall. Then he walked to the house, to the gun cabinet that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. The weapons inside were old but well-maintained, cleaned and oiled with the kind of care a prudent man gave to tools that might one day save his life. Winchester model 1873 rifle, chambered in .44-40 caliber, 15 rounds in the tube magazine. Samuel worked the lever action, the mechanical click, satisfying and final. Colt, single action, Army revolver, 45 long Colt. 6 rounds in the cylinder, the hammer resting on an empty chamber for safety. He checked the action, spun the cylinder, nodded in satisfaction, and finally the Remington Derringer, .41 caliber, small enough to hide in a boot top. 2 shots, point-blank range only, the gun of last resort when all other options had failed. Samuel loaded all 3 weapons, then sat down at his kitchen table to wait. The sun painted long shadows across the floor, and outside he could hear the cattle lowing as they settled for the night. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the sounds of a life that was about to end or transform into something else entirely. He thought about Sarah, about the way she used to hum while she cooked, filling their small house with music and warmth. He thought about Benjamin, about teaching the boy to ride, about the pride in his son's face when he stayed on the horse for 5 seconds, then 10, then a full minute. He thought about David, about 2 boys growing up in this hard country, learning to depend on each other because there was no one else to depend on. All gone now, all of them gone, leaving Samuel alone with debts and duties and the kind of anger that had nowhere to go except inward, eating at him like acid. The sound of horses pulled him from his reverie. Multiple riders moving fast, not bothering with stealth. Samuel stood, checked his guns one last time, and walked to the door. He opened it before they could knock, stepped out onto the porch with his hands visible and empty. No point in giving them an excuse to shoot him where he stood. 7 men sat on horses in his yard, Nathaniel Blackwood in the center, his gray beard catching the last light of day, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. To his left, Leonard Graves, 62 years old and wealthy beyond measure, his expensive suit incongruous in this rough setting. To his right, three cowboys Samuel did not know. Hired guns probably, the kind of men who would do anything for $20 in a bottle of whiskey. And flanking them, two deputies. One was Jake Morrison, a young hothead who spent more time drunk than sober. The other was Tom Fletcher, barely 26 with a face that still held traces of boyhood despite the badge pinned to his chest. Blackwood spoke first, his voice carrying the false authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Samuel Cross, you are under arrest for assault and moral corruption of Sister Margaret Hartwell." Samuel kept his face neutral, his voice level. "I saved that woman's life, Blackwood. She was bitten by a rattlesnake. I removed the venom. That is the sum total of what happened. That is not what the witnesses say." Blackwood urged his horse forward a few steps. "They say they saw you in a compromising position with a woman of God. They say she was crying and begging you to stop. Then your witnesses are either blind or liars, probably both." Leonard Graves laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Always so self-righteous, Cross, just like your brother. We all remember how that worked out for him." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, confirming what he had always suspected. Graves was admitting it, right here in front of witnesses, admitting that David's death had been no accident. Samuel's hand twitched toward his gun, and immediately the three rifles came up, pointed at his chest. "Go ahead," Graves said softly. "Give them a reason. I would love to see you dead in your own dooryard, Cross. It would save everyone a great deal of trouble." Samuel forced himself to breathe, forced his hand away from the weapon. Graves wanted him to fight, wanted an excuse to kill him right here and call it self-defense. He would not give the bastard the satisfaction. "You will not shoot an unarmed man, Graves. Not in front of this many witnesses. Even you have limits." "Do I?" Graves smiled, and Samuel saw madness in that smile, or something very close to it. "You have been a thorn in my side for 3 years, Cross. Asking questions, making accusations, stirring up trouble. I should have dealt with you the same night I dealt with David, but I thought you would give up eventually, would let the past stay buried where it belonged. I was wrong." Blackwood shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. "Leonard, maybe we should take him to town first. Let the judge decide what happens." "The judge will do what I tell him to do, Nathaniel, the same as you." The words hung in the air, ugly and true. Samuel saw the confirmation on Blackwood's face, saw the sheriff's shame and anger warring with his greed. Whatever honor Nathaniel Blackwood had once possessed, Leonard Graves had bought it years ago and was now using it like a club. Jake Morrison, drunk and eager for violence, spurred his horse forward. "Why are we even talking? Let's just string him up now and be done with it." He swung down from his saddle, lurching slightly as his boots hit the ground. Before Samuel could react, Jake's fist caught him in the jaw, a wild haymaker that had more rage than skill behind it. Samuel staggered, tasted blood, and Jake hit him again, this time in the ribs. Samuel could have fought back, could have drawn his gun and shot Jake Morrison in the face, could have killed all of them probably, if he was willing to die in the process. But Tom Fletcher was there. Young Tom Fletcher, who Samuel had seen at church, who still had decency written across his face despite the badge he wore. Samuel let Jake hit him twice more before the other deputies pulled the drunk cowboy away. He dropped to one knee in the dust, breathing hard, tasting blood and defeat. His hands were pulled roughly behind his back, and iron cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The metal was warm from the sun, already chafing against his skin. Blackwood dismounted, walked over to Samuel, and leaned close enough that only Samuel could hear. "You should have left the past alone, Cross. Should have accepted that David's death was an accident and moved on with your life. But you could not do that, could you? You had to keep digging, had to keep asking questions. Well, now you will pay the price for your curiosity. Come Sunday, there will be a reckoning, and by the time the church bells ring, you will be swinging from a rope. For saving a woman's life? For whatever I say you did. Remember, Cross, I wear the badge. I say what the law is, and the law says you die." They hauled Samuel to his feet, shoved him toward a horse. He took one last look at his ranch, at the house and barn and the 3 crosses on the hill. One last look at everything he had worked for, everything he had left. Then they threw him onto the saddle and rode toward redemption, toward the stone jailhouse where Samuel had once visited David during a land dispute, never imagining he would one day occupy the same cell. The sun had fully set now, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, and Samuel wondered if he would live to see another sunrise. Probably not, almost certainly not. But as they rode through the gathering dark, as redemption's lights appeared on the horizon like the fires of hell itself, Samuel caught a glimpse of something on the ridge to the east. A small figure, barely visible in the twilight, watching the procession with careful eyes. A boy, young, maybe 12 or 13, with long dark hair and skin the color of burnished copper. Navajo, Samuel thought. One of the reservation kids who sometimes came down to the settlements to trade. And if the boy had been on that ridge all day, if he had been tending goats near where Sister Margaret was bitten, then he might have seen everything. Might have witnessed the snake and the rescue and the wagon full of lying witnesses. Samuel could not call out, could not signal, could not do anything except lock eyes with that distant figure for one brief moment. But in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, a promise. The boy had seen, and if Samuel lived long enough, if he could somehow survive until Sunday, then that boy might be the only witness who could save him. They rode on into redemption, and Samuel Cross allowed himself one small ember of hope in the darkness that was closing around him. One witness, one chance, one last opportunity to prove that truth could triumph over lies, even in a town where lies were the currency of power. He would need that hope in the days ahead, because in the stone jailhouse that awaited him, in the darkness and cold of that cell, hope would be all he had left. The redemption jailhouse smelled of sweat and despair, a scent Samuel had come to recognize during the long hours since they had thrown him into this cell. 8 feet by 10, stone walls thick enough to muffle screams, iron bars that had held better men than him before they met their end at the gallows. The single cot was a plank of wood with a thin blanket that did nothing against the cold that seeped up from the floor. A bucket in the corner served purposes Samuel preferred not to think about. And on the wall, carved with fingernails and knife points and whatever desperate implements previous occupants had found, were names, 14 names to be precise. Samuel had counted them 3 times in the darkness, tracing each letter with his eyes. 14 men who had occupied this cell before him. 14 men who had walked from here to the gallows in the town square. And at the bottom of the list, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the small window, one name that Samuel recognized. The 14th name made Samuel's chest tighten. Miguel Herrera, dead 7 years, convicted of horse theft on testimony everyone knew was bought and paid for. Another innocent man fed to redemption's version of justice. Samuel wondered if his name would join that list, if some future prisoner would trace the letters of Samuel Cross and wonder what crime had brought him to this place, what lie had sealed his fate. The sound of footsteps in the corridor pulled him from his dark thoughts. Heavy boots, moving with purpose but without urgency. Not Blackwood, then. The sheriff walked with the swagger of a man who believed his own authority. These steps belonged to someone older, someone who had learned that confidence did not require performance. The footsteps stopped outside Samuel's cell. A key rattled in the lock and the door swung open with a metallic groan that spoke of rust and neglect. Father Michael O'Reilly stood in the doorway, a candle in one gnarled hand, a cloth bundle in the other. At 69 years old, Michael looked every day of it and more. His hair was white as fresh snow, his face a roadmap of wrinkles earned through decades of witnessing human suffering and offering what comfort he could. But his eyes were still sharp, still held the fierce intelligence that had kept him alive through famine in Ireland, through the voyage across an ocean, through 40 years of frontier ministry. Samuel, Michael said quietly, glancing back toward where the guard sat snoring at his desk. I brought bread, and something more important than bread. He stepped into the cell, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft click. Michael set the candle on the floor, unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small loaf and a leather-bound journal, worn and water-stained and unmistakably old. Samuel stood slowly, his ribs protesting where Jake Morrison's fists had connected. He took the bread automatically, but his eyes were fixed on the journal. Is that what I think it is? His voice came out rough, unused after hours of silence. Your brother's diary. David gave it to me 3 days before he died. He knew they were coming for him, Samuel. He knew, and he wrote down everything. Every meeting, every threat, every piece of evidence he had gathered about Blackwood and Graves. He made me promise to keep it hidden until the time was right. Michael held out the journal, and Samuel took it with hands that trembled despite his best efforts to control them. The leather was soft with age and handling, the pages yellowed but still intact. He opened it to a random page and saw his brother's handwriting. That careful script David had learned from their mother, who had been a school teacher back in Missouri. July 10th, 1884. Blackwood came to the ranch today, said Graves wants to buy my land for the railroad expansion. Offered $2 an acre when we both know it is worth $8. When I refused, Blackwood smiled, said Graves does not like stubborn men, said stubborn men tend to have accidents. I told him to get off my property. He left, but not before looking at the barn in a way that made my skin crawl. I think they are going to try something. I think I need to prepare for the worst. Samuel turned the page, then another, reading quickly. David had documented everything. The threats, both implicit and explicit. The visits from Blackwood's deputies, always at night, always when David was alone. The stories David had heard from other ranchers who had sold their land to Graves for pennies on the dollar, who had taken the money and left rather than face whatever consequences came with refusal. And then, on a page dated 3 days before David died, the final entry, July 14th, 1884. I found a kerosene tin near the barn this morning, hidden in the brush where someone dropped it or left it deliberately as a warning. I showed it to Samuel but told him not to worry, that it was probably nothing. That was a lie. I know exactly what it means. They are going to burn me out. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon. I am writing this down so that if I die, Samuel will know the truth. Nathaniel Blackwood and Leonard Graves murdered me for my land. They killed me because I would not sell. And if Samuel reads this, I hope he will do what I could not. I hope he will see them hang. Samuel closed the journal, and his vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. David had known and had tried to protect Samuel by keeping quiet about the danger, had died thinking he could spare his younger brother the burden of vengeance. He loved you, Michael said softly. Everything he did to keep you safe. And I have spent 3 years trying to avenge a death I could not prevent. Samuel's voice was hollow. 3 years gathering evidence that was right here, in this journal, and all along. David wanted you to live, Samuel, not to die trying to make things right. But circumstances have changed. With you in this cell, with Blackwood planning your execution, we cannot afford to wait any longer. The time for patience has passed. Samuel looked up at the priest, saw something in Michael's eyes he had never seen before. Not fear exactly, more like resignation. The look of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it, regardless of the cost. Father, what are you planning? Michael pulled a second item from beneath his robe, a ring of keys heavy and iron, marked with the county seal. Samuel recognized them immediately. They were the master keys to the jailhouse, the ones that opened every cell, every door, every lock in the building. How did you get those? From Deputy Hanson's desk. He was kind enough to get drunk and pass out after I provided him with 2 bottles of excellent Irish whiskey. He will not wake until morning, and by then we will be long gone. Samuel stared at the old priest, at this man who had spent 40 years preaching forgiveness and peace, who was now proposing jailbreak and fugitive flight. Father, if you do this, they will excommunicate you. They might hang you alongside me. I am 69 years old, Samuel. I have lived longer than I deserve, longer than most men get in this hard country. I watched Miguel Herrera hang in 1881. He was accused of stealing horses from Leonard Graves. But I knew the truth. Graves had given Miguel those horses in payment for work, then accused him of theft to avoid paying wages. Miguel had proof, had papers. But the judge was in Graves' pocket, same as always, and I said nothing. I knew he was innocent, and I said nothing. I chose the safety of the church over the life of an innocent man, and I have carried that guilt every day since. I will not make that mistake again. If they hang me for doing the right thing, then at least I will die with a clear conscience. The cell door opened again, so quietly Samuel did not hear it until a figure stepped through. For a moment his heart stopped, certain that Blackwood had discovered their plan. Then the candlelight caught the visitor's face, and Samuel saw not the sheriff, but Sister Margaret, her face pale but determined, still limping slightly from the snake bite. "Sister," Samuel breathed, "what are you doing here? If they catch you, then they catch we doing what should have been done hours ago. I will not hide behind convent walls while an innocent man waits for execution." She turned to Michael. "Father, you said you had a plan." "I said I had the beginning of a plan. The rest we will improvise as we go." Michael held up the keys. "These will get us out of the jail, but getting out of town is another matter entirely. Blackwood will have men watching the roads, and once he discovers Samuel is gone, he will send every deputy and hired gun in the county after us." "Then we do not use the roads," Margaret said. She had changed out of her nun's habit, Samuel noticed. Now she wore simple traveling clothes, men's trousers and a work shirt that were too large for her frame. Her hair was uncovered, pulled back in a severe bun, and without the distinctive wimple, she looked like any other woman preparing for a hard journey. "There is an old mining trail that leads northeast toward the Navajo reservation. It is overgrown now, barely passable on horseback. But if we can reach it before dawn, we can be 20 miles away before they even know where to look." Samuel shook his head. "And then what? We cannot run forever. Blackwood has the law on his side, even if we make it to the reservation. Even if we hide there for weeks or months, eventually he will find us. And when he does, we will hang for jailbreak in addition to everything else. Which is why we are not running to hide." Michael's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "We are running to find the one witness who can prove your innocence. The Navajo boy who saw what really happened on that ridge. Sister Margaret tells me his name is Elijah Silverwind and that he delivers goat milk to the convent twice a week. If we can find him, convince him to testify, we might have a chance." "A Navajo boy's testimony against 3 white women? Father, you know how that will play in court." "Perhaps, but it is the truth, and truth has a way of revealing itself if given enough time." "Sice," Michael hefted the journal. "With David's evidence and the boy's testimony combined, we might have enough to cast reasonable doubt on Blackwood's version of events. At the very least, we can force a real trial instead of the lynch mob Blackwood is planning for Sunday morning." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to point out the dozen ways this plan could fail, the 100 things that could go wrong. But looking at Michael's determined face and Margaret's fierce eyes, he realized that argument was futile. They had made their choice, had committed themselves to this course of action. The only question now was whether Samuel would honor their sacrifice by fighting or insult it by surrendering. "All right," he said quietly. "We do it your way. But Father, if this goes wrong, if Blackwood catches us, you tell him I forced you at gunpoint. You tell him I took Sister Margaret hostage. You make sure your name stays clear, even if it means blackening mine further." "Absolutely not. Those are my terms, Michael. I will not have your death on my conscience, along with everyone else I have failed to save." The priest and the rancher locked eyes, 2 stubborn men engaged in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Michael nodded, though his expression made clear he had no intention of honoring that promise. "Fine. Now let us go before Hanson wakes up and ruins everything." They moved through the jailhouse like ghosts, Michael leading with the candle, its small flame casting wild shadows on the stone walls. Hanson sat at his desk exactly as Michael had described, head pillowed on his arms, a puddle of drool spreading across the arrest ledger. 3 empty bottles stood in formation beside him, silent testimony to the priest's effective planning. The main door opened without sound, well-oiled hinges swinging smooth. Samuel stepped out into the night air, breathing deeply of freedom, even though he knew it might be temporary. The moon was high and bright, 3/4 full, providing more light than he would have liked for a jailbreak. But there was no help for that. They would have to move quickly and hope that luck favored them more than it had favored David. Margaret led them through back alleys and empty lots, avoiding the main street where late-night drinkers might still be stumbling home from the saloons. Redemption slept around them, 847 souls dreaming their various dreams, unaware that 3 fugitives crept through their town like thieves in the night. The livery stable stood at the eastern edge of town, a large structure that housed maybe 30 horses on any given night. The owner, a man named Carlson, who Samuel knew slightly, would be asleep in the apartment above the main floor. They would have to be silent, would have to work by touch and memory in the darkness. But as they approached the stable door, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Samuel's hand went to his waist, reaching for a gun that was not there, cursing himself for forgetting that Blackwood had confiscated his weapons. Then the figure moved into the moonlight, and Samuel recognized the face. Tom Fletcher, the young deputy with the honest eyes and the conscience that had not yet been completely corrupted by proximity to Blackwood's evil. "Going somewhere, Mr. Cross?" Tom's voice was quiet, almost conversational. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Tom and the others. "Tom, you do not want to be part of this. Just walk away. Forget you saw us." "Can't do that, sir. I'm a deputy. Got a duty to uphold the law." "The law?" Samuel could not keep the bitterness from his voice. "You saw what happened today, Tom. You saw Morrison beat me while I was unarmed. You heard Graves all but admit to murdering my brother. Is that the law you want to uphold? Is that the badge you want to wear?" Tom's jaw worked, muscles jumping beneath young skin that had not yet learned to hide emotion. His hand hovered near his pistol, not drawing, but not relaxed either. Samuel prepared himself for the fight, calculating angles and distances, knowing he would probably lose, but determined to give Michael and Margaret time to escape. Then Tom's hand moved, not to his gun, but to his badge. He unpinned it slowly, deliberately, and held it up so the moonlight caught the metal. "My father lost his ranch 3 years ago. Same tactics Graves used on your brother. Threats, intimidation, then a mysterious fire that burned his hay storage. He sold for pennies on the dollar and died 6 months later from a broken heart. I took this badge thinking I could change things from inside, thinking I could be one good man in a corrupt system. I was wrong. The system does not change for good men. It eats them alive and spits out their bones." He threw the badge into the dirt at Samuel's feet. "Go, take the horses in the back 3 stalls. They are the fastest Carlson owns. I will tell Blackwood I was knocked unconscious, that you jumped me from behind. Should buy you a few hours a head start before he can organize a pursuit." Margaret stepped forward, her voice soft with something that might have been hope. "Tom, why are you doing this?" "Because Mr. Cross is right. That is not the law I want to uphold. And if I have to choose between my badge and my conscience, I choose conscience every time." He looked at Samuel. "Find that Navajo boy, get his testimony. Come back to town before Sunday and demand a real trial. Judge Pemberton is corrupt, but he is not evil. If you can put enough evidence in front of him, enough that the whole town sees it, he might have to act fairly. It is a long shot, but it is better than running forever." Samuel extended his hand, and after a moment Tom took it. The grip was firm, the handshake of equals, of men who understood that honor sometimes required breaking the very rules that were supposed to define it. "Thank you," Samuel said simply, because there were no other words adequate to the moment. They took the horses Tom had indicated, 3 strong geldings already saddled, as if someone had known they would be needed. Samuel helped Margaret mount, noting how she moved stiffly, favoring her injured leg. She would slow them down, he knew, but there was no question of leaving her behind. She had chosen this path as surely as any of them. Michael mounted with the ease of a man who had spent half his life on horseback, back when he was a circuit rider, bringing religion to scattered settlements. The old priest might be 69, but he sat his saddle like he was 40, straight-backed and ready for whatever came next. Samuel swung onto his own horse, felt the animal shift beneath him, testing his weight and authority. "Easy," he murmured, running a hand along the animal's neck. "We have a long night ahead. Let us make it through together." They rode out of Redemption, heading northeast, following dirt paths that paralleled the main road without using it. Behind them, the town continued to sleep, unaware that the man they planned to hang at dawn was already 20 miles away and moving fast. The desert at night was a different world from the scorching hell of daytime. Cool air replaced suffocating heat, and the landscape that seemed barren under the sun revealed hidden life in the darkness. Coyotes called to each other across the arroyos, their voices rising and falling in ancient harmonies. Owls hunted on silent wings, and somewhere in the distance, a mountain lion screamed. The sound so human it raised the hair on Samuel's neck. They rode for 2 hours without speaking, pushing the horses hard, but not to the point of exhaustion. These animals would need to last them all the way to the Navajo reservation and back, would need to have reserves of speed and stamina when Blackwood's men finally caught up. Because they would catch up, Samuel had no illusions about that. The only question was when, and whether Samuel's group would have found Elijah Silverwind before it happened. Margaret broke the silence first, her voice tight with pain she was trying to hide. How much farther to the mining trail? Another hour, maybe less. Are you all right, sister? I am not a sister anymore, Mr. Cross. That ended when I left the convent tonight. And yes, I am managing. The pain is bearable. But Samuel could hear the lie in her voice, could see how she gripped the saddle horn with both hands, how every step the horse took caused her to wince. 3 days had passed since the rattlesnake struck. In normal circumstances, with proper medical care and antibiotics, the wound would be healing, but nothing about their situation was normal. Desert heat, crude bandaging, constant riding, no rest. The snake bite was infected, he realized. The swelling should have gone down by now, but from here he could see her leg was still inflamed, the skin stretched tight and angry. He pulled his horse alongside hers, reached out to check the wound. Margaret tried to pull away, that old modesty rising despite everything they had been through. Samuel fixed her with a look that allowed no argument. We do not have time for propriety right now. If that wound is infected, you could lose the leg. Let me look. She nodded reluctantly, pulling up the trouser leg to expose the bandage. Even in the moonlight, Samuel could see the dark stains, could smell the sickly sweet odor of infection. He unwrapped the cloth carefully, revealing skin that was hot to the touch, red radiating outward from the twin puncture marks like the roots of some poisonous plant. It is infected. We need to clean it again, properly this time. And you need laudanum for the pain. I have laudanum. Margaret pulled a small brown bottle from her pocket. I took it from the convent's medicine cabinet before I left. I am not completely unprepared, Mr. Cross. Samuel, he said, working the cork free from the bottle. If we are going to be outlaws together, you might as well call me by my given name. She almost smiled at that. Very well, Samuel, and you may call me Margaret. I suspect we will know each other too well for formalities by the time this is over. He helped her drink, then used some of the laudanum to clean the wound, the alcohol burning away infection and making Margaret gasp despite the numbing effects of the drug. He rewrapped the bandage with strips torn from his own shirt, tying it tight, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. You will need a real doctor soon. This is beyond my skill. Then we will find a real doctor after we clear your name. One crisis at a time, Samuel. They rode on, and gradually the land began to change. The flat scrub land gave way to rolling hills, then to rocky outcrops that thrust up from the earth like the bones of some long-dead giant. The mining trail appeared almost by accident, a gap between two boulders that opened onto a path barely wide enough for a single horse. This is it, Margaret said, the old copper mine trail. 40 years ago, this was a busy road, hundreds of men hauling ore down to the smelters in Redemption. But the copper played out in the 60s, and now hardly anyone remembers it exists. They entered the trail single file, Michael leading, Margaret in the middle, Samuel bringing up the rear. The path wound upward through the rocks, sometimes so narrow that Samuel's legs brushed stone on both sides. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient courses, indifferent to the small dramas of mortal men struggling below. Dawn was breaking in the east, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, when they finally emerged onto Coyote Ridge. The Navajo reservation stretched before them, a vast expanse of high desert punctuated by mesas and dry washes. Somewhere out there, among the scattered hogans and sheep pens, lived a boy named Elijah Silverwind, who held Samuel's fate in his hands. The sound of gunfire shattered the morning quiet. Samuel reacted on instinct, hauling his horse around, canning for threats. Behind them on the trail they had just climbed, he saw riders. 4 of them, maybe 5, too distant to identify but close enough to shoot. Jake Morrison's drunken laugh echoed off the rocks, confirming Samuel's worst fear. Blackwood's men had found them far sooner than expected. "Ride!" Michael shouted, and they rode. The horses stretched into a gallop, hooves striking sparks from stone, racing across the ridge top with death pursuing close behind. More gunshots, the whine of bullets passing too close, and then Margaret's horse stumbled. The animal recovered, but Margaret did not. She slid sideways in the saddle, her injured leg unable to grip, and Samuel watched in horror as she began to fall. He was moving before conscious thought, reaching out, catching her waist with one arm, and hauling her across his saddle. The extra weight made his horse falter, losing precious speed, and the pursuers gained ground rapidly. "There!" Michael pointed ahead to a narrow canyon that cut between two mesas. "We can defend that." They plunged into the canyon, the walls rising sheer on either side, blocking out the sun and plunging them into premature twilight. 50 yards in, the canyon widened into a small bowl, maybe 30 feet across, with a scattering of boulders that would provide cover. Michael dismounted, already pulling the ancient pistol he kept hidden in his robe. Samuel slid down with Margaret in his arms, carrying her to the largest boulder and propping her against it. "Can you shoot?" he asked. She pulled a small revolver from her belt, one he had not known she was carrying. "Convent life teaches many skills, Samuel. Self-defense is one of them. Where did you think we got the meat for dinner?" Despite everything, Samuel found himself grinning. This woman who had been too modest to show her leg to save her life was now preparing to shoot at men twice her size without hesitation. People were endlessly surprising, even in the worst circumstances. The riders appeared at the canyon mouth, silhouetted against the rising sun. 5 of them, as Samuel had guessed. Jake Morrison in the lead, his face flushed with excitement, or liquor, or both. 2 deputies Samuel did not recognize. And bringing up the rear, 2 hired guns, the kind of men whose only loyalty was to the highest bidder. "Cross!" Jake's voice bounced off the canyon walls. "You got nowhere to run. Come out and we will make it quick." Samuel stepped out from behind the boulder, putting himself between the guns and his companions. His voice when he spoke was calm, reasonable, the tone of a man negotiating over fence lines rather than his life. "Jake, you are making a mistake. We have evidence that proves Blackwood and Graves murdered my brother. Evidence that will see them hang if it gets to a judge. Is that really the side you want to be on when this all shakes out?" "I am on the side that pays my wages. Now either you surrender or we come in there and take you." "Plus, then I guess you are coming in, because I am not surrendering to a corrupt sheriff and a lynch mob." Jake spurred his horse forward, and the canyon erupted in gunfire. Samuel dove behind his boulder as bullets chipped stone and whined off into the morning air. Michael's pistol boomed, ancient but still functional, and one of the deputies screamed and fell from his saddle. Margaret's smaller revolver cracked twice, missing but forcing the riders to scatter for cover. Samuel had no gun, having left his weapons in Blackwood's custody. But among the rocks at his feet, he found what he needed. A stone heavy and smooth, the size of a large egg. He had been throwing stones since he was 5 years old, had killed rabbits and birds for dinner when ammunition was too expensive to waste. His arm drew back and snapped forward in one fluid motion, and the stone caught Jake Morrison in the temple with a sound like an axe hitting wood. Jake toppled from his horse, unconscious or dead. Samuel neither knew nor cared. The other men hesitated, suddenly less certain about their easy prey. Another boom from Michael's pistol. Another man down. 3 left now, and their courage was evaporating faster than dew on a hot morning. Then the cavalry horn sounded, clear and unmistakable in the canyon's acoustics. The remaining riders turned, and Samuel saw their faces go white with fear. From the canyon entrance rode help Samuel had not dared hope for. Tom Fletcher at the head of a column of men wearing federal badges. U.S. Marshal and 4 deputies, their guns drawn and pointed at what remained of Blackwood's posse. "Drop your weapons." The marshal's voice allowed no argument. "You are all under arrest for attempted murder." The hired guns threw down their rifles immediately, hands reaching for the sky. Only one deputy tried to run, and he made it maybe 10 feet before 2 marshals had him face down in the dirt, wrists being bound behind his back. Tom Fletcher dismounted, walked past the prisoners to where Samuel stood among the rocks. The young man's face was grave, but his eyes held satisfaction. You were right to trust me, Mr. Cross. I rode straight to Tucson after you left. Told the marshal everything I knew about Blackwood and Graves. Took some convincing, but your brother's journal helped. The marshal has been looking for an excuse to investigate redemption for years. You just gave it to him. Samuel wanted to respond, wanted to thank Tom for the salvation he had just delivered. But the adrenaline was wearing off now, and with it came the realization of how close they had come to dying in this canyon. His legs buckled, and he sat down hard on the boulder, head in his hands, breathing deeply of air that suddenly seemed too thin. Margaret's hand touched his shoulder, gentle and grounding. Michael appeared on his other side, the old priest's pistol still smoking in his weathered grip. They had survived. Against all odds, despite every reasonable expectation, they had survived. But their work was not finished. They still needed to find Elijah Silverwind, still needed his testimony, still needed to face Blackwood and Graves in a court of law and prove beyond doubt that Samuel Cross was innocent of the crimes they had manufactured. The sun continued its climb into the morning sky, indifferent to human drama, marking the passage of time that was both their enemy and their ally. Sunday was still 2 days away, 2 days to find a boy, convince him to risk his life, and return to redemption for a trial that would determine not just Samuel's fate, but the fate of justice itself in this hard country. Samuel stood, testing his legs, finding them steady again. He looked at Tom and the marshal, at the prisoners being lined up and bound. Marshal, I appreciate the rescue, but we cannot go back to redemption yet. There is a witness we need to find first. A Navajo boy who saw what really happened when I saved Sister Margaret's life. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You have until Saturday sundown, Mr. Cross. That gives you 2 days to find your witness and get back to town. Sunday morning there will be a trial, public and proper. Judge Pemberton has already been notified, and I have taken Blackwood into custody. The man will answer for his crimes, all of them. But you need to be there to testify, and you need to bring that witness with you. Understood? Understood, Marshal, and thank you. Do not thank me yet. We still have a long way to go before justice is served. Now get moving, sundown Saturday. Don not make me come looking for you. They remounted, this time with Margaret on her own horse again, steadier after the laudanum had fully taken effect. Samuel looked back once at the canyon, at the place where his life had nearly ended, where salvation had come in the form of an honest deputy and a federal marshal willing to do his duty. Then they rode north toward the heart of Navajo territory, toward a boy named Elijah Silverwind, who might be their last hope of seeing truth triumph over lies. In Redemption's jailhouse, Nathaniel Blackwood paced his cell, hands clenched into fists. He had underestimated Cross once. He would not make that mistake again. And in the darkness beyond town, 3 riders with no badges spurred their horses north. Leonard Graves had not built an empire by accepting defeat. If the law would not hang Samuel Cross, hired guns would finish the job. The Navajo reservation stretched before them like an ocean of red earth and scattered sage, punctuated by mesas that rose from the desert floor like ancient sentinels keeping watch over secrets too old for white men to understand. Samuel had been to the reservation only twice before, both times to trade cattle, and he had learned quickly that the Navajo people had their own ways, their own laws, their own sense of justice that predated federal badges and territorial courts by centuries. They would not welcome strangers riding hard across their land, especially not white strangers fleeing white man's justice. But they had no choice. Elijah Silverwind was out here somewhere, and finding him was the difference between Samuel hanging for a crime he did not commit and proving that corruption could be defeated, even in a place as broken as redemption. They rode in silence through the morning, the sun climbing higher and turning the air into something that shimmered and wavered like water. Margaret had tied a cloth over her mouth and nose against the dust, and even through the fabric, Samuel could hear her labored breathing. The infection in her leg was getting worse despite the laudanum and his crude bandaging. She needed a real doctor, needed antibiotics and proper surgery, needed things that did not exist out here in the wasteland between civilization and the old ways. Father Michael rode with his head down, lips moving in what Samuel assumed was prayer. The old priest had killed a man back in that canyon, had watched his bullet punch through flesh and bone, had seen the light go out of another human being's eyes. That kind of thing changed a man, even a man of God who believed in forgiveness and redemption. Michael would carry that weight for whatever time remained to him, and no amount of prayer would ever make it light again. Samuel's own thoughts were darker still. He had thrown the stone that felled Jake Morrison, had aimed for the temple with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of surviving in hard country. He did not know if Jake was dead or merely unconscious, and the terrible truth was that he did not particularly care. Jake had come to kill him, had shot at Margaret and Michael, had chosen his side in a war between justice and corruption. Whatever Jake got, he had earned. But the ease with which Samuel had made that throw, the lack of hesitation, the cold calculation of angle and force, that worried him. He had become the kind of man who could kill without remorse, who could measure a human life and find it wanting, who could throw away another person's existence like a used tin can. His father would have been ashamed. David would have been horrified. Sarah would have wept. And yet, what choice had they given him? When the law was corrupt and the only justice came from the barrel of a gun or the arc of a stone, what was a good man supposed to do? Roll over and die? Accept the noose because fighting back was ungentlemanly? Samuel had tried that path once, when David died, when he had trusted the system to investigate and prosecute and deliver the justice his brother deserved. That trust had bought him 3 years of nothing, 3 years of watching Blackwood and Graves walk free while David's bones turned to dust under a wooden cross. No, he would not make that mistake again. If the system would not deliver justice, then he would carve it out with his own hands, even if those hands ended up stained with blood that would never wash clean. A figure stepped out from behind a boulder 20 yards ahead. So sudden the horses shied. Samuel's hand instinctively reached for a weapon he no longer carried, but the figure was small, unthreatening. A boy, maybe 13 years old, with skin the color of burnished copper and hair that fell past his shoulders in a thick black cascade. He had been waiting for them. As they drew closer on foot, Samuel could see the bow slung across the boy's back, the careful way he positioned himself with escape routes on either side. He wore traditional Navajo clothing, a cotton shirt, and wool pants that had seen better days, leather moccasins that made no sound even on gravel. One hand rested near the quiver at his hip, ready to draw an arrow in a heartbeat if needed. Behind the boy, scattered across the hillside like white clouds against red earth, a herd of goats grazed peacefully. Maybe 40 animals, their bells making soft music that drifted across the morning air. A dog lay in the shade of a juniper tree, tongue lolling, one eye on the goats and one eye on the approaching strangers. Samuel raised both hands, showing he was unarmed, showing he meant no threat. The boy watched him with eyes that held more wariness than a child his age should possess. Eyes that had seen too much of white man's promises and white man's lies to ever fully trust again. "Elijah Silverwind?" Samuel called out when they were close enough for normal conversation. "Are you Elijah Silverwind?" The boy nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement that gave away nothing. "I know who you are," the boy said, his voice surprisingly deep for his age, his English flawless and unaccented. "You are the rancher they want to hang for helping the sister. I have been watching the trail since dawn. My grandmother said white men would come looking for the bust who saw the snake. When I saw your dust from the ridge, I brought my goats here and waited. I wanted to see what kind of men you were before deciding if you were worth the risk. You are the man Blackwood wants dead because you know too much about how your brother died." Samuel blinked, surprised. "How do you know all that?" "I watch, I listen. White people think Navajo children are invisible, that we do not understand their words or their ways. They are wrong. We see everything, we hear everything, we remember everything." There was something in the way Elijah said it, not boastful but simply factual, that made Samuel believe him completely. This was not a child playing at being clever. This was a young man who had learned to survive by paying attention, by gathering information, by knowing more about his enemies than they knew about themselves. "Then you know why we are here. You saw what really happened. You can testify that I was removing venom from a snake bite, not assaulting Sister Margaret. Your testimony could save my life." Elijah's expression did not change. "My uncle testified in a white man's court 3 years ago. He swore on your Bible that he did not steal those cattle, that he had bought them fairly from a rancher who needed money. The judge did not believe him. The jury did not believe him. They hanged him anyway, and his widow and children were forced off their land because they could not pay the debts my uncle left behind. Why should I testify in your court when I know exactly what will happen? They will not believe me either. They will say I am lying to protect you, and then Blackwood's men will come for my grandmother and me, and we will lose everything just like my uncle's family did. The words hit Samuel like physical blows, each one true and undeniable. He had no counter-argument, no promise he could make that would not sound hollow and false. The boy was right. Testifying was dangerous, possibly suicidal, and offered no guarantee of success. Margaret urged her horse forward, wincing as the movement jarred her injured leg. Elijah, I understand your fear. I understand why you would not trust us, why you would want nothing to do with white man's justice. But I am asking you anyway, not for Mr. Cross, though he deserves your help, not for the law, because the law has failed your people too many times to count. I am asking you for yourself, for the man you will become. Because if you stay silent now, if you let fear dictate your choices, you will carry that silence for the rest of your life. You will wonder if your testimony might have made a difference, if one act of courage might have changed something. That is a heavy burden, Elijah. Trust me. I know. The boy looked at her for a long moment, and Samuel saw something shift in his eyes. Not agreement, not yet, but consideration. The opening of a door that had been firmly closed. Who are you? Elijah asked. You are not Sister Margaret anymore. You wear men's clothes. You carry a gun. You ride with outlaws. Who are you now? Margaret smiled, though the expression was tinged with pain and weariness. I am someone who learned too late that silence in the face of injustice is just another form of complicity. I spent 8 years hiding behind convent walls, telling myself I was serving God when really I was just avoiding life. When that snake bit me, when Mr. Cross risked everything to save me, I realized I had a choice. I could go back to my safe walls and let an innocent man die for his kindness. Or I could step out into the world, risk everything, and maybe for the first time in my life actually do something that mattered. I chose the latter, and I am asking you to make the same choice. Elijah was silent for so long that Samuel thought he would refuse. The goats bleated in the background, the dog yawned and stretched, and somewhere high above a hawk screamed its hunting cry. The world continued turning, indifferent to the decision being made on this lonely ridge. Then Elijah lowered his bow, planted one end in the dirt, and looked directly at Samuel. My grandmother will want to meet you first. She does not trust white men, and she will not let me testify unless she approves. If you can convince her, I will come to redemption and tell your court what I saw. But I warn you, Mr. Cross, my grandmother is not easily convinced, and she has her own reasons for hating men like Sheriff Blackwood. Relief flooded through Samuel, though he tried not to show it. One step forward, one small victory in a war that was far from won. Where is your grandmother? Can you take us to her? Elijah pointed toward a cluster of hogans, visible in the distance, traditional Navajo dwellings made of logs and earth, their domed roofs rising like small hills from the desert floor. She is there, but we walk, not ride. Horses disturb her sheep, and disturbing her sheep will not help your cause. They dismounted, tethered the horses to a stunted juniper, and followed Elijah on foot toward the hogans. Margaret leaned heavily on Samuel's arm, her leg barely supporting her weight now. Father Michael walked beside them, his breathing labored in the thin air and blazing heat. They made a sorry sight, Samuel thought. 3 fugitives, half dead from exhaustion and injury, putting all their hope in the hands of a Navajo grandmother who had every reason to send them away. The hogans sat in a rough circle, 5 of them, each one facing east according to tradition. Sheep grazed in a large pen nearby, and a vegetable garden fought for survival in soil that looked more like sand than earth. A woman emerged from the largest hogan as they approached, straightening slowly from the low doorway, one hand pressed to her back in a gesture Samuel recognized. Agent Hard Work, the same combination that had bent his own spine and put silver in his hair. But there was nothing frail about Mary Silverwind. She stood perhaps 5 feet tall, weathered and worn like a piece of driftwood polished by decades of wind and sun. Her hair was silver, braided in the traditional way, and her eyes were black as obsidian and just as sharp. She wore a long skirt and a velvet blouse adorned with silver buttons. the kind of formal dress that suggested this meeting had been anticipated, prepared for. Elijah spoke to her in Navajo, rapid and fluid, gesturing at the three strangers. Mary listened without expression, her gaze moving from Samuel to Margaret to Michael and back again. When Elijah finished, she was quiet for so long that Samuel began to fear the worst. Then she spoke, her English accented but clear, each word chosen with deliberate care. You are the rancher whose brother was murdered by the sheriff and the rich man. You are the nun who is no longer a nun. And you are the priest who kills men while speaking of God's mercy. An interesting group of outlaws. My grandson tells me you want him to risk his life to save yours. Tell me, Samuel Cross, why should the Navajo people care about white man's justice? What has your justice ever done for us except steal our land and murder our families? Samuel had expected the question, had prepared an answer during the long ride here. But now, standing before this woman who had survived things he could only imagine, all his prepared words felt inadequate and false. So he told her the truth instead. It should not matter to you, Mrs. Silverwind. Your people have suffered enough at the hands of men like Blackwood without being asked to sacrifice more. If I were in your position, I would send us away and forget we ever came here. But I am asking anyway, because I have no one else to ask. Because the system that should deliver justice is broken, corrupted by men who wear badges as disguises for their crimes. And because if good people do nothing, if witnesses stay silent and victims accept their fate, then evil wins by default. Not sometimes, every time. Mary studied him with those obsidian eyes, and Samuel had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing not just his face but his soul, weighing it against some internal measure he could not comprehend. Pretty words, but words are easy. Action is what matters. Elijah, bring the book. The boy disappeared into the hogan and returned carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it to his grandmother, who unwrapped it carefully, reverently, revealing a small notebook with a cover stained and faded by time and weather. 3 years ago, Mary began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, I was gathering herbs on the ridge above Cross Creek Ranch. It was July 15th, 1884, 2 hours past midnight. I could not sleep because of the heat, and night is the best time for finding certain plants that only bloom in darkness. I heard voices, angry voices, 2 men arguing with a third. I moved closer, staying in the shadows, and I saw them clearly by the light of the moon. She paused, and Samuel's heart began to pound. He knew this date, July 15th, 1884, the night David died. One man was large, well-dressed, riding a fine horse. The other had a beard and wore a badge that caught the moonlight. The third man was smaller, trapped between them, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. I heard the large man say, You should have sold when you had the chance, Cross. Now you will sell for nothing, and your land will be ours anyway. The man with the badge laughed and said, Light it up, make it look like an accident. No one will question a barn fire. Then they rode away, and 5 minutes later the barn was burning. I watched the small man run inside to save his horses. I watched him not come out. Samuel's vision blurred with tears he could not control. Mary Silverwind had witnessed David's murder. She had seen Blackwood and Graves at the scene. She had watched his brother die and said nothing for 3 years. Wipumwa. The word came out strangled, barely human. Why did you stay silent? You could have testified. You could have helped me send them to prison. Could I? Mary's voice was gentle but firm. Would your courts have believed an old Navajo woman over a sheriff and a rich white man? My uncle tried to testify in a land dispute. He was beaten and left for dead as a warning. My nephew testified about cattle theft. He was hanged for his trouble. I stayed silent because silence was the only way to protect my family. But I wrote everything down, every detail, every word I heard. I kept this notebook hidden, waiting for a time when speaking might actually matter. Perhaps that time is now. She held out the notebook to Samuel, and he took it with trembling hands. Inside, written in careful English, was everything. The date, the time, the exact words spoken, descriptions of the men and their horses, even a rough sketch of the scene. It was evidence, real evidence, the kind that could not be dismissed or explained away. Mrs. Silverwind, Father Michael said softly, why are you willing to testify now? What has changed? Mary looked at her grandson and something passed between them. Some wordless communication that spoke of love and fear and difficult decisions made in the darkness of the night. Elijah came to me 2 days ago and told me about the rancher who saved the nun. He told me how the town turned a mercy into a crime, how they would hang an innocent man to protect guilty ones. And he said, "Grandmother, if we let this happen, we are no better than they are." My grandson is right. Silence may keep us safe, but it also makes us complicit. I am 68 years old. I have lived a long life, longer than many of my people. If I die bearing witness to the truth, that is a death with meaning. That is a death I can accept. Samuel did not know what to say, did not trust his voice not to break. So he simply nodded, clutching the notebook like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. This small book and the testimony of a Navajo woman and boy were all that stood between him and the hangman's noose. "We ride back to redemption at first light," he finally managed. "The marshal has given us until Saturday sundown. If we leave now, we can make it with hours to spare." "Then we should not waste time talking," Mary said. She turned toward the hogan, calling out in Navajo. A younger woman appeared, maybe 30, carrying a small bundle. Mary spoke rapidly and the woman nodded, disappearing back inside. "My daughter. She will watch the sheep and the goats while we are gone. Elijah, saddle the horses. We have a long ride ahead." Within an hour, they were mounted and moving. 5 riders now, instead of 3. Mary rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent her life on horseback, and Elijah kept pace beside her, the two of them talking quietly in Navajo. Samuel rode at the rear with Margaret, who was fading fast. The infection had spread despite everything, and her skin was hot to the touch, her eyes glassy with fever. "Hold on," Samuel murmured to her. "Just hold on a little longer. We will get you to a doctor as soon as we reach redemption." "Samuel," her voice was barely audible, "if I do not make it, you have to promise me something. You are going to make it. Promise me. Promise that if I die, you will not let it be for nothing. Use my testimony. Tell them what really happened. Make them understand that mercy is not a crime." "I promise, but you are not going to die, Margaret. I did not save you from that snake just to lose you to an infection." She smiled weakly. "Stubborn man, just like the Bible says, 'Blessed are the stubborn, for they shall inherit the earth.' I do not think that is in the Bible." "Then perhaps it should be." They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, pushing hard but not recklessly. The horses needed rest, and Margaret could not maintain a gallop for more than a few minutes before the pain overwhelmed her. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, they were still 10 miles from redemption, and Samuel began to fear they would miss the marshal's deadline. Then he saw riders coming from the south. 6 men, and at their head rode Tom Fletcher, now wearing a U.S. Marshal's star pinned to his chest. After helping them escape, Tom had ridden straight to Tucson and convinced the marshal to deputize him under federal authority. The county badge Blackwood had given him lay in the dirt outside Redemption's stable. This new star represented something better. "Mr. Cross," Tom called out as soon as he was in earshot, "the marshal sent me to find you. He said if you have the witnesses, we ride for redemption tonight. The trial has been moved up to Saturday evening. Judge Pemberton wants to get this over with before anyone else gets killed." "We have the witnesses," Samuel said. "Mary and Elijah Silverwind. They saw everything. But Sister Margaret needs a doctor immediately. She has an infection that is getting worse by the hour." Tom looked at Margaret, saw the fever in her eyes and the way she swayed in the saddle. "There is a doctor in town, Dr. Harrison. He is honest and he owes Blackwood nothing. We will get her there first, then head to the courthouse. The marshal has already taken statements from Father Michael and from me. With the Silverwind's testimony and your brother's journal, we have enough to put Blackwood and Graves away forever. If the judge listens, if the jury believes us, Judge Pemberton has no choice now. The marshal has suspended his authority and taken over the court under federal jurisdiction. This will be a federal trial, not a territorial one. Blackwood's corruption does not extend that far. Justice might actually have a chance." They rode the final 10 miles in darkness, guided by moonlight and the distant glow of Redemption's lamps. As they approached the town, Samuel saw that changes had already begun. Federal marshals stood on street corners, their presence keeping the peace that Blackwood's deputies had never bothered to maintain. The saloons were quiet, almost empty. The whole town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when the sun rose and the trial began. Dr. Harrison's office occupied the second floor of a building on Main Street. They carried Margaret up the stairs, and the doctor, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and capable hands, took one look at her and started barking orders. Hot water, clean bandages, chloroform, surgical tools. Samuel stood in the doorway watching as Harrison cut away the infected tissue, cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, and stitched it closed with neat, precise sutures. "She will live," the doctor finally announced, washing his hands in a basin of pink-tinged water. "But it was close. Another day and I would have been amputating. As it is, she will need at least a week of bed rest and careful monitoring for signs of sepsis. Whatever quack did that initial bandaging probably saved her life, but it was amateur work at best." "That quack was me," Samuel said. "I did the best I could with what I had." Harrison looked at him appraisingly. "Then you have my apologies and my respect, Mr. Cross. You kept her alive long enough to get her here, and that is all that matters. Now get some rest yourself. You look like you are about to fall over." But rest would have to wait. The courthouse bell was ringing, calling the town to assembly. Saturday evening had arrived, and with it the trial that would determine not just Samuel's fate, but the future of justice and redemption. The courthouse was packed with every person in town who could fit through the door, and twice that many stood outside in the street, craning for a glimpse of the proceedings. Federal marshals lined the walls, hands on their weapons, eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Judge Augustus Pemberton sat behind the bench looking older and smaller than Samuel remembered, as if the weight of this trial had physically diminished him. In chains at the defense table sat Nathaniel Blackwood and Leonard Graves, both men stripped of their authority and their dignity. Blackwood's face was purple with rage, his beard unkempt, his eyes wild. Graves looked cooler, more calculating, already planning his defense or perhaps his revenge. The marshal stood to address the court, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This federal court is now in session. The Honorable Augustus Pemberton presiding. The United States government has brought charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, corruption, land fraud, and obstruction of justice against defendants Nathaniel Blackwood and Leonard Graves. Additionally, we are here to resolve the matter of Samuel Cross, who stands accused of assault against Margaret Artwell. Let us begin with the latter, as it was the precipitating incident for all that followed." The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man from the territorial capital, called his first witness. Mrs. Harriet Boone took the stand, her face flushed with self-importance. She told her story exactly as Samuel had expected, painting him as a predator and Margaret as a helpless victim. The prosecutor let her speak, asked no questions, then turned to Samuel. "Mr. Cross, you may cross-examine." Samuel stood, ignoring the whispers that followed his movement. He was still dirty from the trail, still wearing the same clothes he had worn when they arrested him days ago. But his voice when he spoke was clear and steady. "Mrs. Boone, how far away were you when you saw me kneeling beside Sister Margaret?" "Close enough to see what you were doing." "That is not an answer. How many yards?" 50 yards, maybe more." 50 yards. And at that distance, in bright sunlight that creates harsh shadows, you claim you could see clearly enough to determine I was assaulting her rather than providing medical aid?" "I saw what I saw." "Did you see blood on her leg?" "Yes." "Did you see the snake that bit her?" "There was no snake." "Did you bother to ask what was happening before riding back to town and spreading your gossip?" Mrs. Boone's face went even redder. "I did not need to ask. It was obvious what you were doing." "Was it? Or did you see what you wanted to see? What would make for the most interesting story at the saloon?" "How dare you?" "I dare because you are prepared to send an innocent man to the gallows based on assumptions and gossip." "That is how I dare, Mrs. Boone." He dismissed her and called his own witnesses. Father Michael testified about finding Samuel in his cell, about David's journal, about everything that had led them to this moment. Tom Fletcher testified about Blackwood's corruption, about the orders to kill Samuel rather than arrest him. Margaret, pale but determined, limped to the stand and told the truth about the snake bite, about Samuel's actions, about how the town had twisted mercy into sin. And finally, Samuel called Mary and Elijah Silverwyn. The courtroom went silent as the old Navajo woman took the stand. Even Judge Pemberton leaned forward, his earlier disinterest replaced by keen attention. Mary spoke slowly, clearly, recounting what she had seen the night David Cross died. She identified Blackwood and Graves without hesitation. She produced her notebook and read from it, her voice never wavering despite the murderous looks both men directed at her. When she finished, Elijah took her place. The boy spoke with a maturity beyond his years, describing in precise detail what he had witnessed on the ridge. The snake, the bite, Samuel's medical intervention, the wagon passing by. He answered every question the prosecutor asked, never hesitating, never contradicting himself. The defense attorney, a nervous man clearly out of his depth, tried to discredit them based on their race. Why should this court believe 2 Indians over 3 upstanding white citizens? The marshal stood, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Because these 2 Indians have no reason to lie, while the 3 white citizens have every reason to embellish. Because their testimony is supported by physical evidence and multiple corroborating witnesses. And because in a federal court, justice is not determined by the color of a person's skin, but by the weight of the truth they speak. Now sit down before I hold you in contempt. The attorney sat. Judge Pemberton cleared his throat, looking around the courtroom as if seeing it for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been all day. I have presided over this court for 20 years. In that time, I have made decisions I am proud of and decisions that shame me. I allowed corruption to flourish because it was easier than fighting it. I turned a blind eye to injustice because confronting it would have cost me my position. I sentenced Miguel Herrera to hang knowing in my heart he was innocent, because to rule otherwise would have made powerful men angry. That is the truth of who I have been, a coward in judge's robes. He paused and Samuel saw tears in the old man's eyes. But today I choose to be something different. Today I choose to let the law be what it was always meant to be, a shield for the innocent and a sword against the guilty. The jury will now deliberate on the charges against Samuel Cross. The 12 men filed out, and the courtroom erupted in whispers and speculation. Samuel sat at his table, exhausted beyond words. Margaret beside him, still pale and weak but alive. Her hand in his trembled slightly, the fever not yet fully broken, but her eyes were clear and focused. The jury returned in less than 10 minutes. We find Samuel Cross not guilty of all charges. The courtroom exploded in cheers and shouts, some celebrating and some protesting. The marshal restored order with difficulty. Then everything happened at once. Leonard Graves's hand disappeared into his coat. The movement was smooth, practiced. Samuel saw it a heartbeat too late. The Derringer emerged, small but deadly, its single barrel aimed directly at Samuel's heart. If I hang, you die first, Cross. Time shattered into fragments. Margaret screamed. Tom Fletcher's hand flew to his holster, but he was 10 feet away. Too far. The marshals were focused on the celebrating crowd, turned the wrong direction. A rock flew through the air. It struck Graves's wrist with an audible crack of bone. The Derringer clattered to the courthouse floor unfired. Federal marshals swarmed Graves instantly, slamming him face down as he howled in pain. Samuel turned. Elijah Silverwyn stood near the back wall, arms still extended from the throw, face perfectly calm. The boy nodded once. Samuel nodded back. The debt was paid, the circle complete. Judge Pemberton turned his attention to Blackwood and Graves. As for you two, the evidence against you is overwhelming. You conspired to murder David Cross for his land. You attempted to murder Samuel Cross to cover up that crime. You corrupted the office of sheriff and used it as a tool of oppression rather than justice. Nathaniel Blackwood, Leonard Graves, I find you guilty of murder in the first degree, conspiracy, corruption, and every other charge leveled against you. You will be taken from this place and held until such time as you can be transported to the territorial prison where you will serve life sentences at hard labor. May God have mercy on your souls, because this court has none. Blackwood lunged across the table, murder in his eyes, hands reaching for Samuel's throat. Federal marshals tackled him before he made it halfway, dragging him back in chains. Graves sat perfectly still, his face a mask, but Samuel saw something break behind his eyes. The realization that it was over, that wealth and influence had finally met their limits. As they dragged both men from the courtroom, Graves turned one last time to look at Samuel. This is not over, Cross. Even from prison, I have reach. You will never be safe. Perhaps, Samuel said quietly, but I will be free, and you will rot in a cell knowing that a simple rancher and an old Navajo woman defeated you. That knowledge will eat at you every day for the rest of your miserable life. The courtroom slowly emptied, people drifting back to their homes and their lives. The drama concluded. Samuel remained seated, unable to quite believe it was finished. Margaret squeezed his hand one more time, then stood with the help of a crutch Dr. Harrison had provided. Where will you go? Samuel asked. Santa Fe, as I planned. There is a teaching position waiting and children who need to learn. But I will write, and perhaps, when I have figured out who Margaret Hartwell truly is, I will come back. I will be here. She kissed his cheek, a brief touch of lips against weathered skin. Then she pulled back, her hand still resting on his shoulder. Samuel, I am going to Santa Fe to learn who I am when I am not hiding behind walls or vows. But when I have the answer, I am coming back. Not as a nun you saved, not as someone who owes you a debt, but as a woman who would like to know the man who risked everything for her. Samuel's throat tightened. How long? 6 months, maybe less if the children learn to read quickly. She smiled and it reached her eyes. Will you wait? I waited 3 years for justice, Margaret. I can wait 6 months for something that matters more. She squeezed his shoulder once, then limped away, supported by Father Michael. The old priest gave Samuel a tired smile and a small salute before following her out into the night. Samuel walked out of the courthouse into the cool evening air. Tom Fletcher stood on the steps, his badge restored, his face peaceful for the first time since Samuel had met him. What will you do now, Tom? Take over as sheriff, if the town will have me. Try to rebuild what Blackwood destroyed. It will take time, but I think we can make this place into something decent again. What about you? Go home, work my ranch, pay my debts if I can, try to live a life that would make David proud. They shook hands, and Samuel walked toward where Apollo waited, still patient after all these days. As he prepared to mount, he heard footsteps behind him. Mary and Elijah Silverwind approached, the old woman's face as unreadable as ever. You are going back to your ranch, Mary said. It was not a question. Yes, ma'am. Then we will come with you, for a few days. Elijah should learn what he can from you. Ranching, cattle, how to live on this land that was once ours and is now divided into properties with fences and deeds. He should learn both worlds, the old ways and the new. Would you teach him? Samuel looked at the boy, saw hope and eagerness warring with the caution that had been beaten into him by a harsh world. He thought of Benjamin, of the son he would never teach to ride or shoot or work the land. He thought of David, of the brother who had protected him even in death. He thought of all the things he had lost and could never recover. And then he thought of what he could still give. It would be my honor, Mrs. Silverwind. Elijah, if you want to learn, I will teach you everything I know. Fair warning, though, ranch work is hard, and the pay is nothing but food and a place to sleep. Elijah's face split in a grin that made him look like the 13-year-old boy he actually was, instead of the old soul he had been forced to become. When do we start? Dawn tomorrow. Fences need mending, cattle need checking, and there is a whole ranch that has been neglected for too long. Time to get back to the work of living. They rode out of redemption together, 4 people bound by shared trauma and unexpected friendship. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called, hunting the small creatures that emerged only at night. The desert smelled of fire and dust and the promise of rain that might never come. Cross Creek Ranch appeared on the horizon as the moon rose, the buildings dark but solid, waiting. Samuel dismounted, helped Mary down, and watched as Elijah immediately went to investigate the barn with the curiosity of the young. "He is a good boy," Mary said. "He will make a good man if the world does not break him first. Then we will make sure the world does not get the chance." Samuel walked to the hill where 3 crosses stood beneath the oak tree. He knelt in the dry grass and placed one hand on David's grave. "It is done, brother. Blackwood and Graves will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Not the gallows you deserve to see them hang from, but justice nonetheless. And I have found something else. A boy to teach, a purpose beyond vengeance. Maybe that is what you wanted all along. Maybe that is the gift you were trying to give me." The wind rustled through the oak leaves, and Samuel chose to believe it was David answering. That his brother understood, forgave him for taking so long, approved of the path forward. He stood, dusted off his knees, and walked back toward the house where Mary was already starting a fire, and Elijah was asking a dozen questions about everything he saw. Father Michael had promised to visit in a week, to check on them and perhaps stay for a while. Margaret would write from Santa Fe. Tom Fletcher would stop by when he could, learning to be the sheriff redemption needed. Life would go on as it always did. The land would demand its due in sweat and blood and endless toil. The cattle would need tending, the fences would need mending, and the debts would still have to be paid. Though with Graves in prison and his empire seized by federal court, Samuel suspected that $800 debt would disappear along with all the other fraudulent loans Graves had used to steal land. Tom had mentioned something about a federal audit. Justice, it seemed, came with unexpected bonuses. Nothing had fundamentally changed except everything. Samuel Cross was free. Not just free from prison or execution, but free from the weight of unavenged murder, free from the burden of carrying David's death alone, free to build something instead of destroying himself in pursuit of justice that could never fully satisfy. He stepped into his house, into the warmth of Mary's fire and the sound of Elijah's eager questions, and closed the door on the darkness outside. The ride back to the ranch had been quiet, too quiet. Michael had not spoken a word since the trial ended, had not met anyone's eyes, had barely touched the food Mary offered. Samuel recognized the signs. He had worn them himself for 3 years after David died. Later that night, Samuel found Father Michael sitting alone beneath the oak tree, staring at David's cross. The old priest's shoulders shook. Samuel sat beside him without a word. After a long silence, Michael spoke, his voice raw. "I killed a man today, Samuel. Shot him through the heart. The church will say it was justified. God may forgive me, but I see his face every time I close my eyes." "That man came to kill us all," Samuel said quietly. "You saved Margaret, Mary, Elijah. You saved me. Did I save them, or did I damn myself?" Michael's hands trembled. "I have preached mercy for 40 years, and in one moment, I chose violence. What does that make me?" Samuel had no answer. They sat in silence as stars wheeled overhead, 2 men carrying the weight of necessary killing, knowing some stains never wash clean. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and all the 1,000 difficulties of life on the frontier. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Samuel Cross would sleep without nightmares. And that was justice enough.